My name is Dr. Michael Chen, Senior Virologist, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Atlanta, or at least I was. The security clearances don't mean much when you're the one who watched containment fail. The protocols that were supposed to prevent exactly what I'm about to tell you became meaningless the moment I saw what was happening on level B3. But I still wear the badge, still remember the procedures, still follow the safety protocols that couldn't save us. Because some part of the structure still matters, even when that structure has become the source of humanity's extinction. This is day 0, hour 14 since initial containment breach. I've been at the CDC for 12 years, working in high-security virology labs that study the deadliest pathogens known to science. BSL-4 facilities where we handle Ebola, Marburg, weaponized anthrax, and experimental viruses that exist nowhere else on Earth. We follow protocols that have prevented laboratory accidents for decades. Air filtration systems, positive pressure environments, full-body protective suits, decontamination procedures that take 45 minutes to complete properly. The whole works. Now those same systems that were designed to protect humanity have become the distribution network for something that shouldn't exist. The CDC Viral Special Pathogens Branch facility in Atlanta houses the most dangerous biological materials on the planet. Building 18, Sublevel 3, contains research specimens that could end civilization if they ever escaped controlled environments. We study them to develop vaccines, to understand transmission vectors, to prepare for natural outbreaks or biological attacks. The irony is suffocating. We created the very thing we spent our careers trying to prevent. When the accident happened, I was in my office on level 2, reviewing genetic sequencing data from a project I can't discuss in detail even now. Classified research into viral enhancement techniques, ostensibly for defensive purposes, developing countermeasures for biological weapons that hostile nations might deploy. The kind of research that requires congressional oversight, international treaty compliance, and ethical review boards that spend months debating whether the knowledge we might gain justifies the risks we're taking.
Dr. Jennifer Walsh, our lead microbiologist, came running into my office at 13:47 hours without knocking, without following normal laboratory security procedures. Her face was white, her hands shaking as she tried to explain what she'd witnessed in the BSL-4 laboratory where our team had been conducting aerosol transmission studies. "Michael," she said, "we have a problem, a big problem. The negative pressure system on B3 failed during the centrifuge operation. When the specimen containers ruptured, the virus didn't get contained. It got distributed." The specimen she was referring to was designated VX117, a synthetic virus we'd engineered by combining genetic material from 3 different respiratory pathogens. Enhanced for transmission speed, modified for immune system evasion, designed to study how such a weapon might spread through a population before vaccines could be developed. It was never supposed to leave the laboratory. It was never supposed to be exposed to human subjects. It was never supposed to become airborne outside of controlled conditions. But engineering failures don't respect human intentions. The centrifuge operation that was supposed to create purified samples for vaccine development instead created an aerosol cloud when the containment vessels fractured under stress they weren't designed to handle. The negative pressure system that should have immediately contained any airborne particles had malfunctioned due to a maintenance error that hadn't been detected during routine safety checks. And the emergency containment protocols that should have sealed the laboratory automatically had been disabled for routine equipment replacement. 3 safety systems failed simultaneously. The probability calculations we'd done during facility design suggested that scenario had a likelihood of less than 0.001%. We'd accepted that risk because the alternative was not conducting the research at all, leaving ourselves vulnerable to biological attacks we couldn't defend against. Now I understand that probability calculations are meaningless when the consequences of failure include the end of human civilization. I followed Dr. Walsh down to Sublevel 3 through security checkpoints and decontamination chambers that were now useless because the contamination was already spreading through the building's ventilation system. The BSL-4 laboratory was in emergency lockdown, sealed by blast doors that should have contained the outbreak but were being bypassed by air circulation systems that had never been designed to handle this type of contamination event. The laboratory technicians working in the affected area had been exposed during the initial breach. 3 people, Dr. Sarah Kim, a graduate researcher who'd been operating the centrifuge, Mark Rodriguez, a laboratory assistant who'd been monitoring safety systems, and Dr. Patricia Williams, our senior biosafety officer who'd been supervising the experiment. All 3 were exhibiting initial symptoms of VX117, symptoms that our research had documented but never expected to see in human subjects. The virus worked exactly as we designed it to. Initial respiratory infection causing severe coughing and blood-streaked sputum, rapid viral replication in lung tissue leading to acute respiratory distress, immune system suppression that prevented natural recovery, and, most significantly, an incubation period of only 4 to 6 hours before symptoms appeared, combined with high viral shedding that made infected individuals extremely contagious before they realized they were sick.
Dr. Kim was coughing blood onto her surgical mask, trying to speak coherently while experiencing the respiratory distress that our computer models had predicted would be fatal in 89% of cases. Rodriguez was unconscious, his breathing rapid and shallow, his body fighting an infection it couldn't understand because the virus had been designed to evade every natural immune response that evolution had developed over millions of years. Dr. Williams, despite being our most experienced biosafety professional, was exhibiting the neurological symptoms that indicated the virus was attacking brain tissue in addition to respiratory systems. I realized 3 things simultaneously. First, VX117 was performing exactly as designed, which meant these 3 people would be dead within hours. Second, the containment failure meant the virus was already spreading through the building's ventilation system, potentially exposing hundreds of CDC personnel. Third, once the virus escaped the CDC facility, there was no force on Earth that could prevent global pandemic. The building's alarm systems were broadcasting containment alerts that instructed personnel to follow evacuation procedures designed for chemical spills, not viral outbreaks. Security guards were implementing lockdown protocols that assumed the contamination could be isolated to specific laboratory areas, not distributed throughout the building via air circulation. Administrative staff were following emergency procedures that had been written for scenarios where containment was still possible, not for situations where the most dangerous virus ever created was already spreading through one of the most heavily trafficked government facilities in Georgia. I left Dr. Walsh coordinating the emergency response with facility security and went directly to my office to make the most important phone call of my life. Not to the CDC emergency response team, not to the Department of Health and Human Services, not to the Pentagon or the White House Situation Room. I called my wife.
Sarah answered on the second ring. I could hear normal life in the background. Our daughter Emma practicing violin. Our son David arguing with someone on his Xbox. The television broadcasting afternoon news that had no idea the world was about to end. Normal sounds from a normal house where normal people were living normal lives that would be impossible in approximately 6 hours. "Michael," she said, "you're calling from work. That's unusual. Is everything okay?" I had rehearsed this conversation in my head 1,000 times during disaster preparedness training, but no simulation had prepared me for the reality of telling my family that I had accidentally caused the apocalypse. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Don't ask questions right now. Just listen. There's been an accident at the lab, a serious accident. A virus we were studying has escaped containment, and it's spreading through the building." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Are you hurt? Are you safe? Should I come get you?" "No, don't come anywhere near here. Don't let the kids come anywhere near here. Sarah, this virus, we engineered it. It's not natural. It's designed to spread faster and kill more efficiently than anything that exists in nature. I was exposed during the containment failure.
I'm probably infected. I can't come home." I could hear her breathing change, could picture her sitting down heavily in the kitchen chair where she drank coffee every morning, trying to process information that didn't fit into any normal framework for understanding crisis. "What do you mean you can't come home? What do you mean, engineered? Michael, you're scaring me." "Sarah, in about 2 hours, people in Atlanta are going to start getting sick, really sick, and the news is going to start reporting something they'll probably call a flu outbreak or a food poisoning incident, because the government won't want to cause panic until they understand what's happening. But this isn't flu. This isn't natural. This is something we created in a laboratory, and once it gets into the general population, there's no stopping it." The background noise in the house had stopped. Emma's violin practice, David's gaming session, even the television seemed quieter. Sarah was processing the implications of what I was telling her, and I could hear in her silence that she understood the scope of what was happening. "How bad?" she asked. "Conservative estimates based on our modeling suggest 85% mortality rate in unvaccinated populations. There is no vaccine. There are no effective treatments. The virus kills most people within 48 to 72 hours of symptom onset, and people are contagious 6 to 8 hours before symptoms appear. It spreads through respiratory droplets, survives on surfaces for extended periods, and remains infectious in aerosol form for up to 4 hours in optimal conditions." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "What do we do?" This was the moment I'd been dreading since I started working on classified viral research. The moment when theoretical disaster became personal catastrophe. When abstract risk calculations became concrete instructions for my family's survival. Remember the property in Hawaii? The one I told you was just a vacation investment. The compound you never wanted to talk about? The one with all the construction you said was for privacy? It's not a vacation compound. It's a survival bunker. Full biological containment. Independent power and water systems. 5 years of food storage, medical facilities, communication equipment. I built it because I knew research like what we were doing carried risks that emergency preparedness couldn't address through normal channels. I'd spent 8 years and most of our savings constructing a survival facility that I hoped we'd never need, located on a remote section of Hawaiian coastline that I'd purchased through shell companies to avoid government surveillance, equipped with everything necessary to survive complete societal collapse. I told Sarah it was a retirement project, a place where we could escape if my career in government research became too stressful. She'd never questioned the elaborate security systems or the underground construction that had taken 3 years to complete. "Sarah, you need to get the kids and leave for Hawaii immediately. Not tomorrow, not in a few hours, right now. Take the emergency bags I packed and stored in the basement. Use the credit cards I gave you for emergencies. Don't pack anything except essential medications and documents. Every minute you delay increases the probability that you won't be able to travel at all." She was quiet for almost 30 seconds. I could hear her thinking, processing the enormity of what I was asking her to do. Abandon our life in suburban Atlanta, evacuate our children from their schools and friends, travel 4,000 miles to an isolated bunker based on my warning about a laboratory accident that hadn't yet appeared on any news reports. "How long?" she asked. "How long do we stay there?" "I don't know. Months, probably. Maybe years. Sarah, this virus is going to collapse everything. Transportation systems, power grids, medical infrastructure, government services. Even if a vaccine is developed eventually, it will take years to manufacture and distribute enough doses to restore anything like normal civilization. You need to be prepared for the possibility that the world Emma and David grew up in no longer exists." I could hear her crying softly, not from fear, but from understanding. She'd always known that my work involved dangerous materials.
had always understood that my security clearances meant I was involved in projects that carried risks beyond normal civilian comprehension. But knowing intellectually that your husband works with dangerous viruses is different from receiving a phone call telling you that those viruses have escaped and are about to kill most of the human race. "What about you?" she asked. "Can't you come with us? Can't you leave work and meet us at the airport?"
This was the hardest part. The part I'd been avoiding thinking about since I'd realized the scope of the containment failure. Sarah, I was exposed. I was in the laboratory area when the breach occurred. I've probably been breathing contaminated air for the past 2 hours. Even if I don't develop symptoms for another few hours, I'll be contagious long before I know I'm sick. I can't risk exposing you and the kids. I can't risk exposing other passengers on an aircraft. I can't risk carrying this virus to the one place on Earth where our family might survive. The silence stretched longer this time. I could hear her struggling with the decision I'd forced her to make. Leave her husband behind to save her children, abandon her marriage to preserve her family's future. It was an impossible choice, but it was the only choice that offered any hope for survival. "How will we know if you're okay?" she whispered. "I'll try to maintain radio contact using the emergency frequencies I programmed into the bunker's communication system. But Sarah, if you don't hear from me, if communication networks collapse, if the bunker systems indicate that external radiation or biological contamination has reached dangerous levels, you seal the facility and you don't open it for anyone. Not for me, not for government officials, not for people claiming to be rescue workers. You protect Emma and David, and you wait until the world becomes safe again." I gave her the coordinates for the Hawaiian property, the access codes for the bunker systems, and detailed instructions for activating the isolation protocols that would keep them safe even if the worst-case scenarios played out. I explained the food storage systems, the water recycling equipment, the medical supplies, and the educational materials I'd prepared for extended isolation. Everything they'd need to survive not just the immediate crisis, but the years of recovery that would follow. "Sarah, I need you to get the kids and leave right now. Don't explain everything to them until you're on the plane. Don't let them call friends or post on social media about traveling. Don't tell anyone where you're going. The fewer people who know about the bunker, the safer you'll be when society starts collapsing." She was crying openly now, but her voice was steady when she responded. "I love you, Michael. We'll survive this. We'll be waiting for you when this is over." I hung up before I could tell her that this would never be over, that the virus we'd created would fundamentally change human civilization, that the world Emma and David would inherit would be nothing like the world they'd grown up in. Because sometimes hope is more important than truth, and sometimes the best thing you can do for people you love is let them believe that survival is the same thing as victory.
What I'm about to tell you, I learned later through communication with Sarah, through monitoring her phone's GPS tracking, through intercepted radio communications, and through reports from other sources who observed their escape. At the time it was happening, I was trapped in the CDC facility, watching the virus I'd created spread through Atlanta while trying to coordinate emergency response efforts that I knew were already too late. But I need to tell you about Sarah's journey because it represents something I never expected when I made that phone call. The courage to act on incomplete information, to trust someone else's expertise even when the consequences seem impossible to believe, to choose survival over normalcy when every instinct argues for maintaining familiar routines. Sarah stood in our kitchen for 30 seconds after our phone call ended, staring at the device that had just destroyed her understanding of reality. Everything looked the same: the breakfast dishes in the sink, Emma's violin sheet music scattered across the counter, David's soccer cleats by the back door. But everything had changed. The normal life they'd built in suburban Atlanta had just become impossible to maintain. Through the bunker's tracking systems,
I watched her move through the house with the efficiency that comes from accepting that normal life has ended. She went to the basement and retrieved the emergency bags I'd prepared years ago. Bags she'd never examined closely because she'd assumed they contained standard disaster preparedness supplies. Instead, she found sophisticated survival gear, encrypted communication devices, medical supplies that required prescription authorization, and cash in denominations that suggested preparation for complete financial system collapse. Emma was in her room practicing violin when Sarah interrupted her to explain that they were leaving immediately for an emergency trip. I can only imagine how that conversation went, trying to convince a 17-year-old that her audition next week didn't matter, that her chemistry test on Friday wouldn't happen, that the future she'd been planning no longer existed. But I know Sarah managed it, because 30 minutes later, the GPS tracker showed all three of them in the car heading toward Hartsfield-Jackson. David was harder to extract from his activities. I'd been watching his online gaming activity through our home network monitoring, knowing he was in the middle of a session with friends from multiple time zones. Sarah had to physically disconnect his systems before he understood that this wasn't a negotiable family vacation. The tracking data showed a 20-minute delay at the house, probably the time it took to convince him that abandoning his spring break plans and his upcoming job interview was actually necessary for survival. The drive to the airport took them through normal Atlanta traffic, past normal businesses and normal people living normal lives that would be impossible within hours. I monitored their route through traffic cameras and GPS tracking, watching my family navigate toward escape while the city around them continued functioning as if the end of the world wasn't already spreading through the CDC facility 12 miles away.
At 4:47 p.m., while they were still driving to the airport, the first news report mentioned the respiratory illness affecting CDC employees. I was monitoring multiple news sources simultaneously while coordinating containment efforts that I knew were futile, watching the media try to interpret information they didn't have clearance to understand. Atlanta health officials are investigating reports of a respiratory illness affecting several employees at a government facility in northeast Atlanta. The report was 8 hours behind reality, describing a contained incident when the virus was already spreading through the city. The GPS tracking showed they reached Hartsfield-Jackson at 5:15 p.m. Through airport security cameras that I could access using my government clearances, I watched Sarah guide Emma and David through a facility that was beginning to implement enhanced health screening procedures. Airport personnel were responding to information that hadn't been released to the public. Additional security staff, medical personnel stationed near gate areas, airline employees having conversations that stopped when passengers approached. The tickets I'd arranged through emergency preparedness protocols were first-class seats on Hawaiian Airlines Flight 47, departing at 7:25 p.m. with connections through Los Angeles to Honolulu. Premium accommodations that hadn't required advance booking, purchased with credit cards that had unlimited authorization for emergency expenses, the kind of arrangements that suggested I'd been preparing for this scenario for years, which I had been. Through airport communication intercepts, I monitored the security screening that was becoming more intensive as the day progressed. Temperature checks that weren't normally required, health questionnaires about exposure to infectious diseases, medical staff observing passenger behavior for symptoms that might indicate contagious illness. My family passed through these procedures because they showed no signs of illness and because they were leaving Atlanta before the outbreak had been officially acknowledged. At 6:15 p.m., while they waited at the departure gate, CNN interrupted regular programming with the first major bulletin about the Atlanta outbreak. I watched through airport cameras as passengers throughout the terminal turned their attention to news broadcasts on their devices, discussing the implications of a disease outbreak originating at the facility responsible for preventing disease outbreaks. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The CDC had become the source of the crisis it existed to prevent. Flight 47 began boarding at 6:50 p.m., 35 minutes before the CDC issued a public statement acknowledging a laboratory incident.
Through air traffic control communications, I monitored the aircraft's departure preparations while Atlanta Emergency Management began implementing quarantine protocols that would escalate rapidly over the next few hours. The aircraft departed Atlanta at 7:31 p.m., carrying 247 passengers who didn't understand they were among the last people to leave the city before complete quarantine. I tracked their flight path while managing the crisis that was consuming the CDC facility, watching my family escape the contamination zone while I remained trapped in the epicenter of humanity's extinction.
During the flight, I maintained limited communication with Sarah through encrypted satellite links that bypassed normal cellular networks. Her messages were brief: updates on their location, confirmation that the children were managing the stress of sudden evacuation, questions about news reports that were becoming increasingly alarming as the scope of the outbreak became apparent to journalists and government officials. By 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time, while Flight 47 cruised over Alabama, the CDC had upgraded the Atlanta outbreak to a public health emergency of national concern. By 9:30 p.m., as they flew over Texas, the Georgia governor had declared a state of emergency and activated the National Guard. By 10:45 p.m., crossing over New Mexico, the president was addressing the nation about the developing situation in Atlanta. None of the passengers knew that containment was already impossible, that secondary infections were beginning to appear in cities across the United States through airline travel that had occurred before anyone understood what was spreading. None of them knew that the civilization they'd left behind was dying faster than any historical pandemic had ever killed, that normal operations would cease within days rather than weeks or months. I knew because I understood the science behind what I'd accidentally released. Through tracking systems and communication intercepts, I watched my family travel toward the bunker that might be humanity's only chance for organized survival, while I remained in Atlanta, coordinating response efforts to a crisis that couldn't be contained, only survived.
While my family flew toward Hawaii, I remained at the CDC coordinating a response effort that was already 12 hours behind the reality of what was happening. The Emergency Command Center had been activated, but our response protocols assumed we were dealing with a containment breach that could be managed through established procedures. Instead, we were trying to contain a virus that had been designed to evade every defensive measure that public health systems could deploy. The first reports of secondary infections came while Flight 47 was over the Pacific. Chicago O'Hare reported 23 cases of severe respiratory illness among passengers and staff who had been present during layovers of flights originating from Atlanta. Dallas-Fort Worth was treating 14 people with similar symptoms. Los Angeles International had confirmed 8 cases among crew members who had serviced aircraft arriving from the southeast. I watched the data stream into the command center while maintaining communication with my family and coordinating with response teams that didn't understand they were trying to fight an engineered pathogen. The virus was spreading through the airline travel network exactly as our computer models had predicted, but those models had been theoretical exercises designed to understand how biological weapons might be deployed. We'd never expected to see them implemented accidentally through our own research facility. Dr. Walsh approached me in the command center at 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time with situation reports that confirmed our worst projections. Michael, we're seeing symptom onset in infected individuals within 4 to 6 hours of exposure, exactly matching the VX117 characteristics we documented. Mortality rate is exceeding 90% among confirmed cases. Medical facilities in 7 cities are reporting they can't treat patients fast enough, and healthcare workers are becoming infected despite protective equipment. The report she was summarizing represented the collapse of medical infrastructure faster than any natural pandemic had ever achieved. VX117 had been designed to overwhelm healthcare systems by killing people faster than hospitals could process them and by infecting medical personnel despite standard protective protocols. Watching our theoretical research become reality was like watching a computer simulation come to life, except the simulation was killing real people in real time. Through secure communication channels, I received updates from government agencies that were beginning to understand the scope of what we were facing. The Department of Health and Human Services was implementing pandemic response protocols designed for natural outbreaks, not engineered viruses that had been optimized for maximum damage. The Department of Defense was activating biological warfare response teams, but they were equipped to defend against foreign attacks, not domestic laboratory accidents.
By midnight Eastern Time, the president was being briefed on a situation that exceeded every emergency planning scenario that had been developed for biological crises. The virus had been confirmed in all major airline hubs across the United States, with secondary infections appearing in populations that had no direct connection to Atlanta. International travel was being suspended, but the suspension was coming too late to prevent global spread through connections that had already occurred. I maintained encrypted communication with my family while coordinating response efforts that I knew were inadequate. Sarah's messages from the aircraft included updates on news coverage that was hours behind the reality of what was actually happening. Passengers were following reports of a severe flu-like illness, while government sources spoke about containment protocols and coordinated response efforts. None of the public reporting mentioned that the outbreak had originated from an engineered virus that had been designed to be incurable and highly fatal. The aircraft's connection in Los Angeles was delayed due to air traffic control complications that Sarah was told resulted from increased security protocols. What she wasn't told was that LAX was implementing pandemic response procedures, screening arriving passengers for symptoms while trying to prevent the spread of infection through terminal areas. I monitored their layover through airport security systems, watching medical personnel conduct health assessments that were designed for natural pathogens, not artificial viruses that could be transmitted before symptoms appeared. Through airport communication intercepts, I observed the changes that were beginning to affect normal operations. Medical teams stationed at every gate, temperature checks and health screenings that created delays throughout the facility, restaurant and retail operations closing as employees called in sick or failed to report for scheduled shifts. The normal flow of people through one of the world's busiest airports was being disrupted by procedures that were probably inadequate for containing a virus engineered for maximum transmission efficiency. Their connecting flight to Honolulu was delayed by 3 hours due to crew availability issues, which I understood meant that airline employees were becoming sick or refusing to work routes that might expose them to infected passengers. Through airline operational communications, I monitored aircraft that were being taken out of service for decontamination, flight crews that were reporting sick in numbers that exceeded normal absence rates, and passenger bookings that were being canceled as news of the outbreak became more serious. During the 5-hour flight from Los Angeles to Honolulu, I watched news coverage evolve from reports of a developing health concern to acknowledgement of a national health emergency to preliminary discussions of pandemic response protocols. The media was trying to interpret a situation they didn't have security clearance to understand, describing symptoms and transmission patterns without knowing that they were dealing with an artificial pathogen that had been designed to kill more efficiently than anything that existed in nature. Communication from government facilities around the country painted a picture of infrastructure beginning to fail as personnel became unavailable to maintain essential services. Power grid operators reporting reduced staff capacity, water treatment facilities implementing emergency protocols, transportation systems shutting down routes to prevent viral transmission. The interconnected systems that supported modern civilization were beginning to break down as the human expertise needed to operate them was eliminated by the pandemic. The Honolulu airport was implementing quarantine procedures for all arriving passengers from the mainland United States when my family's flight landed. Through airport security cameras, I watched medical teams conduct detailed health assessments, require documentation of recent travel history, and ask passengers to provide contact information for monitoring during a voluntary isolation period. The normal vacation atmosphere of arrivals in Hawaii had been replaced by clinical efficiency of emergency medical processing. My family passed health screening because they showed no symptoms and could provide documentation of their departure from Atlanta before the outbreak had been publicly acknowledged. But they were required to provide contact information for follow-up monitoring and were given information about self-isolation procedures they were encouraged to follow for 14 days as a precautionary measure. Through GPS tracking, I monitored their drive across Hawaii's Big Island toward the bunker location, watching them travel through increasingly remote territory away from tourist areas and residential communities that might be affected if the outbreak reached Hawaii through airline travel. The coordinates I'd programmed into their navigation system led them through volcanic landscape toward the survival facility I'd constructed in secret over 8 years of preparation for exactly this scenario. At 3:30 a.m. Hawaii time, I sent them an encrypted message through satellite communication systems that bypassed normal networks. Atlanta, under military quarantine. Federal emergency declared. Disease confirmed in all 50 states. International travel suspended. Mortality projections now exceed 95% in unprotected populations. Facility protocols working correctly. Stay isolated regardless of external communications claiming safety. Trust no one claiming government authority. All love. The message confirmed what I'd been afraid to acknowledge, that my most pessimistic scenarios were conservative estimates of what was actually happening. The United States government was implementing emergency measures that acknowledged the collapse of normal social order. International communities were isolating themselves from American contamination. The virus was spreading globally through travel connections that had been established before anyone understood what was happening. Through the bunker's internal monitoring systems, I watched my family discover the survival facility I'd constructed without their knowledge. The entrance descended through an airlock system that included decontamination chambers, atmospheric pressure controls, and biological filtration systems that could prevent any external contamination from reaching the living areas. Watching them navigate these systems through security cameras, I felt both pride in the engineering and guilt about the secrecy that had made the construction possible. Level 1 contained living quarters that I designed for long-term habitation, individual bedrooms for each family member, a common area with entertainment systems and educational resources, a fully equipped kitchen with food storage calculated to sustain 4 people for approximately 5 years, and bathroom facilities that recycled water and waste through closed-loop systems operating independently of external utilities. Through audio monitoring, I heard Emma's voice as she explored the facility. "Mom, this isn't a bunker. This is like an underground city. How long has Dad been expecting something like this to happen? How long has he been planning for the end of the world?" Her questions reflected the realization that I'd been living with the knowledge that my research carried existential risks, and I'd been preparing for those risks while continuing the work that made them inevitable. Level 2 housed the technical systems that made long-term isolation possible. Water purification and recycling equipment, atmospheric processing that maintained optimal air quality, power generation systems combining solar, wind, and geothermal energy sources, and communication equipment that could monitor global frequencies while maintaining secure contact with networks that might survive societal collapse. The communication systems allowed me to maintain contact with my family while coordinating the failing response effort in Atlanta. Through encrypted channels, I could provide them with information about the developing pandemic that wasn't available through normal media sources. Real-time updates about the collapse of medical infrastructure, the failure of government response efforts, and the global spread of the virus through travel networks that had operated normally until it was too late to prevent international transmission. Level 3 was my laboratory and medical facility.
research equipment that would allow continued study of viral pathogens under controlled conditions, medical supplies including surgical equipment and pharmaceutical stockpiles sufficient to treating serious illnesses and injuries, and biological containment systems that could handle dangerous materials safely even in isolation. The facility had been designed to allow me to continue working on vaccine development even if normal research infrastructure collapsed. Level 4 contains strategic resources for long-term survival. Additional food storage, including seed stocks for agricultural production, manufacturing equipment for producing essential items like clothing and tools, weapons and security systems for defending the facility against hostile intrusion, and archives containing technical knowledge that would be essential for rebuilding civilization if recovery became possible.
Through facility monitoring systems, I watched Sarah realize the scope of preparations I'd made without her knowledge. The bunker wasn't just an emergency shelter. It was a complete survival complex designed to sustain human life for years without external support. I'd spent 8 years and most of our savings constructing a facility that could preserve my family and essential human knowledge through the collapse of civilization. The communication equipment allowed them to monitor global news networks, emergency broadcasts, and government frequencies that were providing information about the pandemic that was exceeding every catastrophic projection emergency planners had ever considered. By the time they completed their initial tour of the facility, the situation on the mainland had deteriorated beyond anything resembling normal crisis management. CNN was broadcasting from studios where half the anchors were absent due to illness, reporting that hospitals in 12 major cities were unable to accept new patients because medical staff were becoming infected faster than they could be replaced. Fox News had switched to automated programming after their Atlanta affiliate lost contact with their main studio. NPR was broadcasting emergency information from undisclosed locations because normal operations had been suspended to protect personnel from infection. Through the bunker's communication systems, David monitored multiple news sources simultaneously, trying to understand the scope of what was happening to the world they'd left behind. "Mom, they're saying that entire hospitals are being abandoned because everyone who works there is getting sick. They're saying that emergency services in major cities have stopped responding to calls because they don't have enough healthy personnel to operate." The reports were fragmentary and inconsistent because normal news-gathering operations were being disrupted by the collapse of systems that made journalism possible. Camera crews abandoning assignments when production staff became ill. Reporters unable to reach locations where important developments are occurring because transportation systems were shutting down. Government officials unavailable for interviews because policy meetings were being suspended to protect personnel from infection. At 3:30 a.m. Hawaii time, I transmitted another encrypted message to the bunker. Atlanta under military quarantine. Federal emergency declared. Disease confirmed in all 50 states. International travel suspended. Mortality projections now exceed 95% in unprotected populations. Facility protocols working correctly. Stay isolated regardless of external communications claiming safety. Trust no one claiming government authority. All love. The message confirmed that my most pessimistic scenarios were becoming reality. The United States government was implementing emergency measures that acknowledged the collapse of normal social order. International communities were isolating themselves from American contamination. The virus was spreading globally through travel connections that had been established before anyone understood what was happening.
Through facility audio monitoring, I heard Sarah gather Emma and David in the main living area to explain what their life would be like for the immediate future, possibly for years, possibly permanently.
They would remain in the bunker until external conditions became safe, which might not happen within their lifetimes. They would maintain communication with the outside world, but wouldn't trust external sources claiming that it was safe to leave isolation. Emma, David, I need you to understand that the world you grew up in no longer exists, Sarah said, using words that echoed conversations I'd had with myself hundreds of times while designing the facility. The schools you attended, the friends you knew, the places we lived, they're probably gone. Not destroyed by war or natural disaster, but infected by a disease that kills almost everyone who gets it. We're not hiding here temporarily until things get better. We're starting a new life here because there might not be anywhere else to go. Emma asked the question that would define their psychological adaptation to isolation. How do we know when it's safe to go outside? How do we know if other people survive? How do we know if there's still a world to return to? Her questions reflected the uncertainty that would characterize their existence for months or years while they monitored communications from a civilization that was dying, waiting for signs of recovery that might never come. The bunker's systems included monitoring equipment that could detect biological contamination in the external environment, air quality sensors that would warn them if atmospheric conditions became dangerous, and radiation detectors that could identify nuclear contamination if the collapse of civilization led to conflicts involving weapons of mass destruction. They would know whether the surface world was becoming safe or becoming more dangerous, but the psychological challenge would be maintaining hope during isolation that might last indefinitely.
2 weeks after my family's arrival in the Hawaiian bunker, the virus I'd accidentally released reached the islands through airline travel that had occurred before quarantine measures could be implemented. The bunker's biological monitoring systems detected viral particles in atmospheric samples, confirming that the pathogen was present in the external environment at concentrations that would be fatal to unprotected populations. The isolation protocols I designed were protecting them from contamination that would have killed them within hours of exposure. Communication with me became increasingly difficult as infrastructure around the CDC facility deteriorated. Power grids were failing as personnel became unavailable to operate generating facilities. Communication networks were degrading as relay stations lost power and technical support, and transportation systems had shut down as fuel supplies became inaccessible and maintenance became impossible. Through encrypted satellite links that bypassed normal communication networks, I transmitted updates about the global situation that weren't available through normal media sources. The pandemic had spread to every continent within 3 weeks of the initial outbreak. Countries that had implemented immediate isolation from international travel were delaying the arrival of the virus, but not preventing it. Nations that had attempted to maintain normal operations were experiencing complete societal collapse within weeks of initial infection. My final message to the bunker, transmitted 3 weeks after their arrival, was sent through emergency frequencies that were still operating when most communication infrastructure had failed. Atlanta abandoned, government relocated, vaccine research continuing in isolated facilities, no timeline for treatment development, facility integrity maintained, proud of family adaptation. All love, always. The message confirmed that I was still alive and still working on solutions to the crisis I had helped create. But it also indicated that normal government operations had been suspended and that vaccine development would require years under the best possible circumstances. They would be isolated indefinitely, potentially permanently, while humanity's remaining scientific resources worked on problems that might not be solvable. Through the bunker's monitoring systems, I could observe how my family adapted to isolation that might last for years.
Sarah organized daily schedules that included education for Emma and David, maintenance of facility systems, monitoring of external communications and recreational activities that would prevent psychological deterioration from confinement and stress. Emma struggled with the loss of her social connections and future plans, spending hours writing letters to friends she might never see again and composing music that reflected her grief for the world she'd lost. But she also took responsibility for monitoring educational broadcasts from institutions that were still operating, distance learning programs being broadcast by schools trying to maintain educational continuity for students who might be isolated for extended periods.
David immersed himself in technical learning, studying engineering and agricultural sciences as if preparing to rebuild civilization single-handedly. He focused on technical communications from engineering and scientific facilities that were sharing information about maintaining infrastructure during societal collapse. Power grid operations for communities still functioning, water treatment protocols for areas where municipal services had failed, agricultural techniques for populations that would need to produce their own food. Sarah monitored government emergency frequencies and international broadcasts, tracking the global spread of the pandemic and efforts by various nations to contain or respond to the crisis. The pattern was consistent across all reporting: massive mortality rates that exceeded 90%, complete collapse of medical systems, and government authority limited to military units implementing quarantine measures but unable to provide effective treatment or prevention. The psychological challenge of indefinite isolation affected each family member differently, but the bunker's design helped them maintain mental health through structured activities and meaningful work. The facility included entertainment systems, exercise equipment, and recreational activities designed to prevent the psychological problems that could develop during extended confinement. But isolation also revealed positive developments that suggested human survival remained possible in some locations. Amateur radio operators broadcasting from isolated communities that had implemented successful quarantine measures. Research facilities maintaining operations and sharing scientific information. Military installations preserving government continuity and coordinating response efforts. Agricultural communities producing food independently of industrial supply chains. 6 months after the outbreak, through the bunker's communication systems, they intercepted broadcasts from a coalition of survival communities that had established communication networks across the Pacific region. Communities in New Zealand, Australia, Alaska, and remote islands that had implemented isolation protocols before the virus arrived, and were maintaining organized society in miniature. These broadcasts included technical information about agricultural production, medical care, education systems, and manufacturing capabilities that isolated communities had developed. Evidence that human civilization was adapting to survival conditions rather than simply dying out. Proof that recovery and reconstruction were possible if sufficient populations could maintain isolation until the pandemic burned out or effective treatments became available. Emma was the first to suggest that their isolation might have a purpose beyond just survival. "Mom, we have all of Dad's research, all the information he collected about the virus. We have the communication equipment to share that information with other survival communities. We have the technical knowledge to help other people understand how to protect themselves and how to develop treatments."
The realization that the bunker could serve as a knowledge distribution center for other survival communities changed their understanding of their mission. Instead of just hiding until the pandemic ended, they could actively contribute to recovery efforts by sharing the scientific and technical information I had preserved. They could become part of the network of communities working to preserve human civilization and develop solutions to the crisis. David began organizing technical archives into formats that could be broadcast to other survival communities, creating educational programs that would help isolated populations develop skills needed for long-term sustainability. Agricultural techniques for producing food without industrial support, medical protocols for treating diseases without access to modern hospitals,
engineering knowledge for maintaining power and water systems in isolation. Sarah established communication schedules with survival communities across the Pacific, sharing information about the virus's characteristics and prevention measures while learning about successful adaptation strategies that other groups had developed. The exchange of knowledge and moral support helped maintain psychological health while building the foundation for eventual reconstruction of organized society. The bunker had evolved from a shelter to a relay station in a global network of human communities that were preserving civilization, while the majority of humanity died from the virus that had escaped from my laboratory. They weren't just waiting for rescue anymore. They were participating in humanity's adaptation to a world where normal life had become impossible, but where survival and eventual recovery remained achievable.
1 year after the initial outbreak, the world that I monitored through government communication networks and that my family observed through the bunker's systems bore no resemblance to the civilization we had known. The global population had declined by an estimated 85 to 90%, with entire regions reporting no communication from population centers that had once housed millions of people. The United States government continued to operate from isolated military installations, but its authority extended only to areas where military personnel could maintain quarantine protocols without external support. Yet humanity was adapting with the resilience that had allowed our species to survive previous catastrophes. The network of survival communities that had established communication across the Pacific had grown to include nearly 200 isolated groups, ranging from small family units like mine to organized settlements with thousands of residents. Each community had developed specialized knowledge and capabilities that contributed to the collective effort to preserve human civilization. Through secure communication channels, I learned that Emma had become their family's primary educator and cultural coordinator, establishing distance learning relationships with other young people in survival communities who were continuing their intellectual development despite the collapse of normal educational institutions. She organized virtual concerts using radio transmission, coordinated writing projects that preserved personal experiences of the pandemic, and maintained cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost during the isolation period. David had developed expertise in sustainable technology and was providing technical consultation to survival communities that needed engineering solutions for power generation, water treatment, food production, and communication systems. His work was being broadcast to communities across multiple continents, helping isolated populations solve practical problems that were essential for long-term survival. Sarah had become a coordinator for what they called the Pacific Survival Network, facilitating communication between communities, organizing resource-sharing agreements, and maintaining archives of information about successful adaptation strategies. Her role required diplomatic skills for mediating disputes between communities with different survival philosophies and organizational abilities for coordinating complex multi-community projects. The bunker's communication equipment was being used as a relay station for communities that couldn't communicate directly due to geographic or technical limitations. Scientific information was being shared between research facilities that were working on vaccine development. Agricultural knowledge was being distributed to communities that were developing sustainable food production. Medical protocols were being coordinated between settlements that had preserved healthcare capabilities. My research archives had become a critical resource for the scientific communities that were working on treatments for the virus I had accidentally released. My detailed documentation of VX117's characteristics provided essential information for researchers who were developing vaccines and treatments without access to the original laboratory facilities. The bunker had become an unofficial CDC backup facility, preserving and distributing the knowledge that would be essential for eventual recovery. Communication with me was restored through military frequencies, confirming that I was still alive and still working on vaccine development at a classified research facility in an undisclosed location. My work was progressing, But vaccine development and production would require several more years, even under optimal conditions. The communities that could maintain isolation during that period would form the foundation for rebuilding human civilization. The psychological adaptation to long-term isolation had been more successful than I had expected when I designed the facility. The sense of purpose that came from contributing to humanity's survival efforts provided motivation that mere waiting for rescue couldn't match. Knowing that their work was helping other people survive and that their preservation of knowledge was contributing to eventual recovery made the isolation bearable and meaningful. 2 years after the outbreak, the Pacific Survival Network had established the foundation for a new form of human civilization, adapted to the post-pandemic world. Communities were specializing in different aspects of survival and recovery. Agricultural settlements that produced surplus food for trade, manufacturing centers that produced essential tools and equipment, research facilities that continued scientific development, educational institutions that preserved and transmitted human knowledge. Trade relationships had developed between communities using barter systems and resource-sharing agreements that didn't depend on monetary systems that had collapsed with normal economic institutions. Transportation was limited to sailing vessels and aircraft that could be operated without industrial fuel supplies. But communication networks allowed coordination of activities across vast distances. The new civilization wasn't just a diminished version of what had existed before the pandemic. It was a more resilient and sustainable form of human organization that had learned to function without the industrial systems that had made the original catastrophe possible. Communities were smaller and more self-sufficient. Technology was more appropriate to local resources and capabilities, and social organization emphasized cooperation and mutual support rather than competition and individual accumulation. My family had become leaders in this emerging civilization, not because they had been chosen for leadership roles, but because their unique situation had given them capabilities that were essential for coordination and communication between isolated communities. The bunker that I had built for their survival had become a nerve center for humanity's adaptation to a world where normal life was impossible, but where meaningful life remained achievable.
3 years after the outbreak, vaccine development had progressed to the point where limited field trials were being conducted in isolated research facilities. Early results were promising, but production and distribution would require the reconstruction of manufacturing capabilities that had been lost when industrial civilization collapsed. The communities that had survived the pandemic would need to cooperate in rebuilding the infrastructure necessary for protecting future generations from the virus that continued to contaminate much of the planet's surface. The recovery process would take decades, possibly generations, but it had begun. Humanity had survived its encounter with the virus that I had accidentally released, not through the intervention of government authorities or medical institutions, but through the adaptation and cooperation of small communities that had learned to preserve civilization in isolation.
This is my final transmission. Day 23 since the outbreak. Day 6 since my family reached the bunker safely. I can feel the virus working through my system now. The respiratory distress is getting worse. The neurological symptoms are beginning. I have maybe hours left, certainly not days. But I need to record this while I still can, because there's something I haven't told Sarah. Something that gives me hope even as I die. While my family was escaping to Hawaii, while I was coordinating the failed response efforts in Atlanta, I wasn't just communicating with them. I was also in contact with Dr. James Liu, my research partner from graduate school, who now works at the University of Hong Kong. James and I had collaborated on viral research for years before I joined the CDC, and when the containment failure happened, he was the first person I called after I spoke to Sarah. James understood immediately what we were facing. His facility in Hong Kong had been studying coronavirus variants, and they had the laboratory infrastructure and isolation protocols that could be rapidly adapted for VX117 research. While my family was flying across the Pacific, I was transmitting every piece of data I had collected about the virus, its genetic structure, its transmission characteristics, its effects on human physiology, and most importantly, our preliminary research into potential vaccine approaches. The data transfer took 18 hours to complete using encrypted satellite links that bypassed normal internet infrastructure. James received copies of our entire research database, 5 years of experimental data on viral enhancement techniques, detailed documentation of VX117's engineered characteristics, computer models of its transmission patterns, and theoretical frameworks for developing countermeasures. Everything we had learned about the virus before it escaped, and everything we observed about its behavior once it began spreading through human populations. James's team has been working around the clock since the outbreak began. Their facility implemented complete isolation protocols immediately. No personnel in or out, all supplies delivered by automated systems, all research conducted under conditions that prevent any possibility of secondary containment failure. They're essentially conducting vaccine research from inside their own survival bunker, protected from the virus that's killing the rest of the world. 3 days ago, James transmitted their first progress report. They've successfully synthesized VX117 in controlled conditions, allowing them to study its behavior without the time pressure and resource limitations that have crippled research efforts in other locations. They've identified the genetic sequences responsible for immune system evasion and rapid transmission. Most importantly, they've developed preliminary vaccine candidates that show promise in computer modeling. The research will take years to complete. Vaccine development, even under optimal conditions, requires extensive testing to ensure safety and effectiveness. Production and distribution will require rebuilding manufacturing infrastructure that's been destroyed by the pandemic. But James has the knowledge base and the protected research environment that could eventually lead to treatments that make the surface world habitable again.
I won't live to see that research completed. The virus that I helped create is killing me exactly as we designed it to, efficiently, rapidly, with no possibility of natural recovery. But knowing that my research data is being used to develop solutions, that my mistake might eventually be corrected through work that I helped make possible, gives meaning to what's happening to me. Sarah doesn't know about James yet. I wanted to wait until the vaccine research showed more concrete progress before telling her, before giving her hope that might not be justified. But she needs to know that the bunker isn't just preserving our family. It's preserving the communication network that allows isolated research facilities to coordinate their work, share their findings, and eventually develop the treatments that could restore human civilization. The bunker I built for my family's survival has become more than a shelter. It's become a relay station in a global network of survival communities and research facilities that are working together to preserve human knowledge and develop solutions to the crisis I helped cause. Emma and David aren't just waiting out a pandemic. They're contributing to humanity's recovery by maintaining communication links and preserving technical knowledge that isolated research teams need to continue their work. In 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, James's research might succeed in developing effective vaccines. When that happens, the survival communities that have maintained isolation will be ready to begin the slow process of reclaiming the contaminated areas. The children who are growing up in bunkers and isolated settlements will inherit a world that's learned the difference between technological capability and biological responsibility. I made a mistake that ended one version of human civilization, but Sarah
Emma and David, along with thousands of other people in survival communities around the world, and researchers like James who are working to develop solutions, are creating something better from the remnants of what was lost. They're proving that humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology or our economic systems or our political institutions. It's our ability to adapt, to cooperate, to learn from catastrophic failures, and to preserve what matters most when everything else collapses. Day Zero was the beginning of the end of one form of human civilization, but it was also day one of something better. A world that will learn to survive because it learned to cooperate, that will learn to thrive because it learned the difference between technological power and human wisdom. My family is safe. The research will continue. Humanity will survive. That knowledge makes dying bearable. This is Dr. Michael Chen signing off. Tell them we tried to build something better from what we destroyed. Tell them the future is worth surviving for.